Let's study this week's Parsha, Hayyei with Rashi's commentary. So we begin in chapter 23 of Genesis, where we learn that Sarah's 127 years old. Hayyei Sarah mea shana ve'esrim shana ve'sheva shanim, shnei Hayyei Sarah. She was 127. V'tamot Sarah b'kiryat arba. Hebron be'eretz Canaan, and she died there in Kiryat Arba, which is also known as Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah, and Avraham came and eulogized her, and he wept for her. In the Torah, believe kota, the word "and he cried for her" or wept for her includes a smaller chaf. A kaf is written just this much smaller than the other letters to signify and symbolize the shrinking of the image of life, God, love, what life holds. And yet, the next verse in chapter 23, verse 3, is Vayakom Avraham me'al pnei mito, that Avraham finds the strength to get up. Usually a word reserved in Jewish mourning customs for the end of Shiva. But here, Avraham finds that strength to lead the family as he must, and in this case, acquire a burial place for his beloved. In making a first opening kind of remark to the holders of the land in Kiryat Arba or Hebron, where he wants to bury Sarah, Abraham begins by defining for them who he is. So he says in verse Dalet, in verse 4, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. I am an alien and a resident among you. Tnuli achuzat kever imachem. Grant me a holding for a grave among you in your land. Ve'ekberra metim milefanai. And I will then be able to bury my beloved. What an interesting opening phrase Avraham uses to describe himself. The phrase in verse 4 that he uses is ger v'toshav. And Rashi notices that, in essence, there's a problem with this phrase, with this description that Avraham gives of himself. How can one be a ger, which means a foreigner, and a toshav, in this case, one who dwells in that city, or a citizen? How can one be a foreigner or sojourner and a citizen at the same time? So Rashi will, on that phrase, offer the following commentary. Ger me'eretz acheret. Let me explain that I am from a different land, a distant land, and I've come here, v'ni yashavti imachem, and I've settled among you. And so by saying ger v'toshav, he's introducing the notion that he came from a foreign place, he's acknowledging that, and now he's a settler in the land. That's pashuta pashat, or pashat pashat, the very simplest sense of the term. And with that definition of both words, the seeming contrast between them doesn't necessarily have to create the confusion that it might if we were to look at each word separately. Taken together, Abraham's telling them, I journeyed from a land, not this land, and here I am dwelling and settling here. And since I'm really here, I plan on burying my dead here. I plan on making my family life here. And we're now part of this landscape. Let's discuss all that needs to be discussed, given that background and the fact that I now am a citizen here with you. But Rashi brings a different explanation, And when there's a midrash after what seems like a simple explanation, we may indeed get some sense that Rashi thinks that there's more to the story. There's more to say. So midrash agadah, and I have an Agadic midrash. That is a midrash that explains it in a little bit of a different way, tells us the story. Im tirtzu, and here's what really the conversation meant when it unfolded between Abraham and the Hittites. If you wish, hareini ger, I'll be an alien. Ve'im lov, ehyeh toshav. But if not, consider me a fellow citizen or a citizen of this land. Ve'etlena min hadin. I'll take the land by my rights. She'amar li HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I've got the deed to this property, and that was the promise that God made to me. L'zarecha etein et ha'aretz hazot. L'zarecha etein et ha'aretz hazot. I promise you this land for you and the generations to come. So what's at the heart of the opening statement that Abraham makes to the Hittites at that time? He says, you could treat me as if I'm a foreigner and tell me no, since I'm just here on the journey from a foreign land and from a foreign place, and I have really no claim to this land. But you might want to treat me as a toshav, because I come with a promise made by the Kadosh Baruch Hu, by my God, by the God of what will be the Jewish people, that this land, in fact, is my own. And I'll have to exercise my rights, Abraham says, and inherit that land in, I think what Rashi might be suggesting is in whatever way I need to acquire it. Given the background that the Canaanites and the Hittites among them know about Abraham, we could imagine that what he's suggesting is that he's willing to fight for it if he needs to. And they become immediately aware of that reality, and they want to give him the land with no trouble. Of course, the story will unfold that Abraham will pay them full price. And later on in verse 9, we learn that when Abraham says, let the cave of Machpelah be granted me, b'chesef malei yitnena li, with the full payment, with the full price that I'll pay, I'll then have a holding place as a grave and for a burial ground for my beloved. Not only do the people want to grant him the burial place that he's asking for because of his reputation, Abraham's personal reputation, but in their response to him, the people in verse 6 call him Nasi Elohim ata b'tochenu. We know you are a prince of God in our midst. B'mivchar kevarenu kavort mitecha. In the choicest of burial grounds, you will have eternal rights to bury your dead. This awareness of Abraham being connected with God, on the one hand, we could read it as an ancient Near Eastern text that implies a concern and a worry on behalf of the Hittites and behalf of Canaanite peoples that God is becoming stronger, that Adonai Elohim is becoming the strongest God of those gods that we consider to be the gods that were worshipped during the ancient Near Eastern history or historical period of Abraham and Sarah. But there's another way to think about it. if we take it to mean that this story is a foundational story about Abraham securing the rights to the land based on the eternal promise of God. We also hear in the way that Abraham makes a relationship happen that he will be ger v'toshav with those who live in the land. First, it recognizes that we may be sharing the land with others, and that it doesn't mean that when we inherit the land, all other peoples will be wiped off the face of ancient Canaan or the face of ancient Israel, or into the future, into our day, that we will have the land all unto ourselves. Two, that he arranges a legitimate contract with those who have a holding there in terms of the unfolding reality of human history. And so it doesn't just rely on God's promise, but relies on the instruments of human business dealings in order to secure rights to the land. Even if God had promised it, he wants to make sure there's a contract that supports it, and having paid full price for it, that there's no questions about the legitimacy of the transaction. Third, there's a suggestion by Rabbi Shmuel Golden in his studies on the Parsha that the term ger v'toshav suggests an Abrahamic, Semitic, a Jewish self-description in terms of how we consider ourselves a people among others, even citizens of Israel among others who live there, and then in every land where the Jewish people is inhabited, where we are ger v'toshav, where, especially in this age of enlightenment and free societies, where we become citizens, we still have a description of being ger, of being a little bit of outside of history, outside of the framework of citizenship within those countries. Of course, he says we have contributed well beyond our numbers to cultures and technology. We've played a role in governance and risen to the top echelons of societal life. But at the same time, however, Jews have been, in some ways, strangers. By choice, we have turned to an outside society and declared our differences. We've stood up and have pride in maintaining our own laws and rituals, our own belief systems, and our own cherished traditions. We have been part of and apart from every civilization in which we've lived. And that balance is so crucial to our future existence as different geopolitical organization of the globe comes and goes, as we've seen throughout history. The Jewish ger v'toshav attitude allows us to attach ourselves to the greatest goals and missions of citizens of polities throughout time. And yet, if we keep ourselves in our own minds as strangers, a little bit outside the framework of just being citizens, but as Jewish journeyers through the length and breadth of ancient Israel in terms of modern Israel and the world, we will indeed be able to negotiate over and over again with the societies around us in order to be sure we're keeping up our end of any moral bargain, sharing space in the right way, and laying claim when it is due and right and just, not only in God's name because of the promises made our ancestors, but in the way we conduct and contract for business, the business of the Jewish people. This notion, of course, is at the heart of the story. Rabbi Golden points out there are more verses in the story of Abraham buying the burial place in Hebron and discussing the transaction with the Hittites than there are verses in the passage concerning the Akedah. And that the ascension of Parshat Hayyei in the Jewish mind as one that teaches us how to be compassionate towards those we love, to live a full life as Sarah's years are recounted, to be comforting of mourners when their time of mourning has come, to be in touch with our emotional lives, to cry as Abraham did over his beloved wife, to arrange in the right ways all we must for those in life and those whom we've lost, to make relationships, strong relationships, not only with our own family. Ultimately, Abraham's children, Isaac and Ishmael, will come back together to bury him when he dies. To not only have strong relationships within the family, within our Jewish family, but with other peoples of the world who would recognize the greatness, yes, the greatness of the one true God of Israel, as the Hittites do when they say, "You are a prince of God among us. Nasi Elohim ata b'tochenu." Perhaps that's a call for more of a trust in God and a relationship with Hashem, and a reflection of that holiness in the every actions we make and commit to in our Jewish lives and as citizens, ger v'toshav. When we bring God into the midst of civilization and societies around us, we are recognized for that. And when we lose our connection to that, perhaps we will lose the connections that we have to all of those incredible values that stem from Abraham's and Sarah's lives as our ancient ancestors. Shabbat Shalom, and may we be inspired by the memories and the legacies of Avraham, Sarah, V'kol Avotinu V'imotenu, all our ancestors. Shabbat Shalom.